nature feeds, but we turn and quake for artificial needs. Come down to earth.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on your time zone. I invite you to please introduce yourselves in the chat. We'd love to know where you're joining us from, what brought you to today's panel called What Comes After the Wilderness Act, and what are you hoping to get out of it? I'll introduce myself. My name is Becca Economopoulos. I'm the executive director for the Natural History Museum. We are a traveling museum for the movement that was founded by artists, activists, and scholars. And this month, we celebrate our 10th anniversary. A ribbon cutting ceremony and opening exhibition took place at the Queen's Museum in New York, where we built a museum within the museum and curated programming with community leaders, artists, scientists, historians, asking critical questions about what perspectives on the world do museums of science and natural history normalize? And can the museum be a part of our social movement infrastructure? What does it look like to not just critique the museum, but reimagine it entirely? As a museum with a mission to advance climate and environmental justice, our opening was timed to coincide with the historic People's Climate March taking place in New York City in 2014. So today, 10 years into this experiment, our panel builds on that tradition. On the 60th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, our speakers are going to explore the question, what is wrong with the act, and what would it mean to rewrite it today? We're going to hear from Heather Whiteman runs him, Kristen Falcon, Carl Jacoby, and our Red Natural History Fellow, Rosalyn LaPier. The event is part of our ongoing series, Natural History for a World in Crisis, which is curated by our inaugural cohort of Red Natural History Fellows. We're supporting these 8 senior fellows in creating public scholarship and field building or field pushing initiatives that can serve to accelerate change, to redress colonial and environmental harms, and advance in both theory and practice a vision for and a version of natural history that honors generations past and charts the path to a just future for all life on Earth. I want to thank our sponsors, without whom this program would not be possible, the Henry Luce Foundation, William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and For Culture. And before we begin, some quick housekeeping. There's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, so you can add any questions for our panelists there. And also, we will be sharing out the recording of today's webinar, as well as the chat's transcript on our website, thenaturalhistorymuseum.org, within a few days. So never fear, you'll get that recording. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the Natural History Museum's Research Director, Steve Lyons, to kick off the event.
All right, welcome everyone to What Comes After the Wilderness Act, which is the 5th event in our year-long programming series, Natural History for a World in Crisis. So in a month where conservation groups across the United States are celebrating this landmark achievement, we're setting ourselves a different task. We want to learn about how our supposedly untrammeled landscapes were made, as well as the systems of Indigenous land management, cultivation, and care that were outlawed in their making. So it's safe to say that most people here know there's a problem with the idea at the center of the Wilderness Act, that there are landscapes that have been untouched by humans, which ought to be protected for our reverence and recreation. But is there anything in the idea of the wilderness that is worth preserving? So as I was preparing for tonight's event, I kept thinking about an essay I read a few years ago by the scholar Andreas Malm, who in an almost heretical move argues just that. After acknowledging that there is, of course, no such thing as absolute wilderness, Malm argues that there is still plenty of what he calls relative wilderness. And this is a concept he defines as follows: landscapes that carry marks of human presence, but have not been built by the exploiters and are not manipulated by them on a daily basis. So Malm here is not referring to national parks, but to spaces and places that for all sorts of reasons have even temporarily escaped the control of oppressive forces. Landscapes that precisely for their wildness have been crucial resources for oppressed and subaltern groups in their struggles for liberation. So we might think of the Maroons of San Domingo, who fled slavery into the mountains, rugged landscapes where they found refuge, subsistence, and a strategic higher ground to wage their resistance. Or we can think of the guerrilla freedom fighters in Guinea-Bissau, who used their country's mangrove forests to their advantage, taking the thick mangroves as places to both hide and to educate young revolutionaries in the midst of their decades-long struggle for decolonization. But we can also think about some of the places that tonight's speakers will be talking about, places that have been integral to the production and reproduction of Indigenous lifeways and traditions that federal policies like the Wilderness Act seek to ban or at least curtail. So there are no tweaks to the Wilderness Act that could enable it to preserve such spaces of relative wilderness. After all, our so-called protected wilderness areas are regulated, managed, controlled, and patrolled by state agencies and their foot soldiers. So to return to Malm's definition, they are most certainly manipulated by the exploiters on a daily basis. So during this evening's panel, we're going to learn about how and why we should critique the Wilderness Act and the ideology it serves to enshrine. And as we do, we'll gather some of the tools we need before we can even begin to ask how we might actually protect and preserve our relative wildernesses, those spaces and places where people are, to this day, actively building a world that does not abide by the rules of the cruel imperialist world that we live in. So with that, I'm going to send it over to Rosalyn LaPier to properly introduce tonight's panel. Thank everyone for joining us tonight.
Well, thank everybody for joining us tonight or this afternoon, wherever you are in the time zone. I'm watching that there's lots of folks from all over, from Alaska to the East Coast and places in between. So it's very exciting to have everybody here to be part of this conversation about the Wilderness Act and what the future holds. So I'll do a quick introduction of myself, and then I'll ask our panel and our speakers to introduce themselves as well. So my name is Rosalyn LaPier again. I'm an enrolled member of the Blackfeet tribe. I'm also Métis. I am trained as an environmental historian. I have a PhD in environmental history, but I'm also trained in the Indigenous knowledge realm. I was traditionally trained as an ethnobotanist by my maternal grandmother and my oldest aunt. And one of the things that I work on besides strengthening our traditional ecological knowledge within Indigenous communities is I do work a lot within public policy and the public policy realm to strengthen Native language within federal policy. I am a professor at the University of Illinois at Champaign, Urbana. That's where my job is. But I do a lot of different things, and so do our panelists. Our panelists, I feel like, all wear multiple hats, both either the jobs that they do as serving as academics, but also working in tribal communities. So I'm going to ask each one of them to first introduce themselves, but then also address a question that is related to their specialty and why we invited them to come and join us on this panel. So I'm going to start with Carl Jacoby, and first, again, introduce yourself and what it is that you do, but then also address for us, sort of provide the framework and the context of the Wilderness Act. When did it get created? Why did it get created? And what does it look like today?
Great. Thank you so much, Roz. I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation. So I'm coming to you from Lenape land. I'm Carl Jacoby. I'm a professor of history at Columbia University, where I teach environmental history and settler-colonial studies. My first book, Crimes Against Nature, looked at the birth of American conservation and its connection to indigenous dispossession, particularly from national parks. And I've also written an effort to try to rethink the anti-indigenous violence of the so-called Indian Wars. That's a book called Shadows at Dawn. And then I've also worked as a consultant for various Native nations on treaty rights cases. It's kind of dangerous to ask a professor to give a very short introduction of something, but I'm going to try to really limit myself to just a couple minutes here. In terms of a very quick history of the Wilderness Act, I wanted to start with the standard narrative, as it were, and then I wanted to end with a slightly less standard, a few thoughts that are less standard. And the impulse towards wilderness areas is very old. I want to say it didn't just start in the 60s. You can certainly trace it back to the 1910s, if not before. And in the 1910s, there was this increase in tourism to national parks, particularly automobile-based tourism, particularly, so the Park Service ended up building a lot of roads in national parks. And this created a lot of dismay on the part of early conservationists who felt like this was not the proper way to be interacting with nature. I think the significant figure here would be the well-known conservationist Aldo Leopold, who I'm sure a lot of you know because he wrote the Sand County Almanac. When he worked for the Forest Service in the 1920s, he led this movement to create in the national forest what he was calling primitive areas, which he defined as areas that maintained primitive conditions of transportation, subsistence, habitation, and environment. What I think is revealing about this even then is you see how nature is often being defined in opposition to something else. So here, nature and this idea of primitive is sort of the modern world, and transportation is not natural, and nature is primitive and is sort of signaled by the absence of mechanical things, at least in Leopold's mind. In 1935, Leopold joins with others to found the Wilderness Society. And then in the late 1950s, after the Wilderness Society had participated in several battles over conservation, particularly the effort to prevent the building of Glen Canyon Dam and Dinosaur National Monument, the Wilderness Society, under its leader, Howard Zasner, leads an effort to kind of build on Leopold's vision of primitive areas and create wilderness areas. And this generates a lot of popular support. So in 1962, for instance, there's a lot going on in 1962, but supposedly the most the most correspondence that Congress was receiving at this point was actually about the Wilderness Act. 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson signs the Wilderness Act into law, and it passes Congress with really deep bipartisan support. So it passes by a vote of 73-12 in the Senate, and then 374-1 in the House. I'd actually be interested to know who that one person was who opposed it. The act offers up the first governmental definition of wilderness, which is something that is worth looking at closely, if we can put that definition up briefly on the screen. Great. So you can see it here. I think the key phrase is this first one: a wilderness in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and the community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor and does not remain. And then I think also number 2 there is very intriguing. It says, talks about wilderness as having outstanding opportunities for solitude, or a primitive, that word again, an unconfined type of recreation. Now, we could spend a lot of time unpacking this. We could probably spend the whole session unpacking this. Let me just zero in on a few really problematic aspects for you. One of these would be the man. It's a very masculinist definition. I think it taps into very old ideas of sort of white manhood is imperiled, and the way to recapture that is to have these authentic wilderness experiences that goes back to Teddy Roosevelt and before. You also see the ways in which wilderness is really just defined in terms of recreation for kind of middle class or upper class consumers. And then, of course, the deepest problem of all, this phrase untrammeled by man, really suggests a complete absence of any indigenous peoples. You notice there's no reference to indigenous peoples at all in this entire definition. And this is part of a very, very long history. It wasn't invented with the Wilderness Act, but this very, very long history of using the notion of wilderness, of uninhabited empty landscape, to erase indigenous homelands and indigenous presence, and indigenous pasts and indigenous futures. So this is one of the more thoughts that environmental historians often don't talk about, but I think is a really important juxtaposition for us to think with, is that the Wilderness Act is passed in '64, so at much the same time as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is one of the key achievements of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Act outlaws discrimination on the basis of race, religion, color, sex, national origin. It prevents unequal voter registration. It outlaws segregation in workplaces, schools, public facilities. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is really this high watermark for the Civil Rights Movement. It's one of the most progressive pieces of legislation in US history. And yet, within just a few weeks of that, you also see the passage of the Wilderness Act, which I think is actually, in certain respects, arguably a much more retrograde act, which really is fundamental to continuing this erasure of indigenous peoples. So there's a lot more that I could say, but that's sort of my very quick introduction. And I'm very curious to hear what the other panelists have to say. I did want to just close by giving you some numbers. There's about 112 million acres in wilderness areas, which is about 4.5% of the US landmass. And this is actually more than the acreage in national parks, which is about 52 million acres. So although we often talk about parks more than we talk about wilderness areas, the wilderness areas are more than twice as large than the national parks.
Thank you, Carl. So next I'd like to ask Heather, Whiteman runs him, to introduce themselves, but then also as part of your introduction to maybe address how you see the Wilderness Act impacting tribes, and how does policies like this, as Carl just explained, policies like this that completely erase indigenous peoples and tribes and their management practices from public policy, how does that impact not just tribes, but sort of everybody?
Okay, thanks, Roz. Hi, I'm Heather Whiteman Ransom. I'm an Apsaalooke woman. I am from the Crow Reservation, but I'm speaking to you today from Tucson, Arizona, which is the territory, the ancestral lands, and the contemporary lands of the O'odham and Yaqui people. Hello from Tucson. My background is as an attorney and as a human, really formed by my experiences growing up on my reservation and returning later on as an attorney to work on behalf of my tribe as in-house counsel for a number of years. I grew up on my reservation in a family that practiced subsistence hunting and also a lot of gathering practices, picking berries, digging roots, all of the things that that our ancestors taught us to do, and that we were so fortunate to be able to preserve a place within our much larger territories to continue those ways and to continue to pass that knowledge on from one generation to another. After law school, I worked for a period of time in New Mexico, and then I returned home to work for my tribe for a number of years, and we had a lot of different interactions with the federal government, federal land management agencies about a wide variety of different topics, whether it was from fossil fuel development projects by either the tribe or the federal government or industry. And we also had a lot of conversations with folks like the National Park Service or the US Forest Service. And a lot of those conversations were really centered around the ways in which the tribe could preserve and rebuild our relationships with landscapes. Now, as a kid, I remember taking field trips to Yellowstone Park as, one of many little Crow kids on a big bus going over to the park. And, we were always told that our tribe had had very minimal contacts and minimal relationships with that landscape. And I think that we were told when we'd come home and and talk to elders or hear from people in the community that perception or that narrative didn't ring true for us, and that we always knew that we had longstanding relationships, a very real and intense presence in some of these places where we were told, our ancestors had signed it away, and that, there was a limited importance or relevance of those areas to us as contemporary people. That narrative, again, didn't ring true for us. And I'm really glad to see the movement today to sort of to control that narrative and to squash it, to change it and to correct it. This concept of wilderness and the minimization of the presence and role of Indigenous peoples in some of these landscapes that are sort of prioritized and promoted as very sacrosanct, almost, I guess untrammeled, that word untrammeled, it's so difficult to unpack that. I think, Carl, there's a lot of unpacking we could do with a lot of the words in these different federal laws and regulations. But yeah, that concept of wilderness, to avoid acknowledging really what happened in the very recent history of the American West, as we call it today, avoiding the acknowledgement of the degree to which Indigenous lands and resources have been appropriated, and the degree to which genocide was perpetrated against our people, by way of creating this myth of pristine landscapes. I think we're almost trying to wash away the stain of these very reprehensible, inhumane acts against Indigenous peoples within our country's recent history. Refusing to acknowledge very difficult truths is it's problematic. It keeps us from moving forward as a society. When Indian people were evicted from vast areas, such as those beautiful areas which became national parks or wilderness areas within national forests, to make way for white settlement and white treasuring and promotion of the pristine nature of those landscapes, we're avoiding the ability to reconcile history, and by avoiding truth, we avoid accountability, and accountability is a key part, and truth is a key part of moving forward and of healing as a society. So in a lot of ways, I see the contemporary impacts of these types of practices, these types of narratives, and the ways in which the law is used as an instrument to promote them, to perpetuate them, that is preventing Indian people from healing from genocide, from healing from the many historical wrongs that were perpetrated on us through both the appropriation of our lands, the assimilation policies that took our children away from us and denied us the right to speak in our tongues, to speak our tongues on the lands where our relationships were really cemented and were integral to our existence. So I hope that's not too broad of an answer, but I think there's a real big picture part of what happens with the concept of wilderness and its assertion over landscapes that are Indigenous, that do have relationships and longstanding obligations and responsibilities of Native peoples, preventing those things from happening and preventing the acknowledgement of them and their significance is very damaging in the present day, both in physical senses as well as spiritual senses.
Well, thank you, Heather. And Kristen, we'd like you to introduce yourself next, but also address a couple of questions. So one, as you know, you're a small business owner. One of the things that you do is take people on guided hikes. And I would like to know, the people that you do work with, what is it that they want to experience? And then what is it that you want them to take away after having spent time with you and your business? So what is it that you're sharing about the natural world that hopefully that they are taking away with them, that they can have a different relationship with it, besides these sort of what we've already talked about, what Heather has talked about and Carl in terms of these tropes? that have existed for such a long time as wilderness as sort of this empty space.
Awesome. Well, hello everyone. Hello everyone. My name is Twice Stolen Woman. My American name is Kristen Falcon. I am currently based here in East Glacier, Montana, on the Blackfeet Nation. It resides right up against Glacier National Park and right under Canada, the Canadian border. So yeah, as Rosalyn was saying, I am a co-owner of a business called Backpackers Ferry. We are a transportation and shuttle business operating on the east side of Glacier National Park. That with the ecotourism business, I also I work for a program. It's called Piikani Lodge Health Institute. It's based here in Blackfeet Nation, and it's aimed at community development through using our TEK, our traditional ecological knowledge, and really getting down to kind of flipping Western science and really utilizing it as our own and using our own Blackfeet methodologies to do different things. So you can see us working with our small producer, working with our agricultural producers, working in programs such as our projects such as beaver mimicry, and all of these projects are aimed at to really utilize what we're doing in Blackfeet culture and work with our climate. The main place where I stay or that I research is our traditional foods and really getting our community on the land and getting used to kind of that overwhelming sense of being away from the land. So living right up and against Glacier National Park, of course, our people have had such huge dissonance, some huge troubles in the last, 150 or so years. After the 1800s, and once the Park Service really started coming in here, and they stole this piece of the land to be able to make this tourism, to make this part of the park. But for us, that was where we got our stories, where we got our ceremonies, where we practice a lot of our ways, where we got much of our teachings from, was from those mountains. They were our refuge and still are today, our refuge today. So the problem though is when the park came in and took that away from us and really kind of pushed us out, even though we live right next door, over these last 100 years, we could see that connection begin to dissolve, and there wasn't as strong as of a relationship as there once were. So we're seeing folks not being used to their own foods, their own medicines, what's going on in the climate, what's going on with policy, what's going on in their world, actually. Oftentimes, it's not a lie that tribal nations, that we deal with greater traumas and greater issues than the rest of the population does. We suffer from chronic diseases, from autoimmune diseases, from our food, from our environmental stressors, things like that. And we often can be stuck in a survival mode. So one way of a strategy of getting folks out of that survival mode is getting them back on the land. And so doing things, whether it's harvesting, hiking, playing traditional Blackfeet games, playing traditional Native games, going skiing on the land, cross-country skiing, doing different things through all seasons of the year, you start to kind of take them out of that bubble of survival mode and start to get them into a place where they're getting their hands in the dirt, they're getting their hands in the snow, harvesting, eating these foods, they're high energy from the land, and they're starting to awaken, that cell memory, and starting to be able to, the things that are coming back to me from the mountains, this type of plant, the ceremony, the songs, the teachings, all of that will start to come back. But you have to get yourself away from that survival mode and into kind of a place of rest and healing and getting that nervous system balanced out. So we do that. We get a lot of people out on the land, youth, our community, family members, things like that, and getting them more used to going into the park. We have these different treaty rights inside of the park, whether that's harvesting. So we try to push that, I guess, getting kids out on the land. You can see them picking berries and sweet pine and things like that, and digging roots. And, they often get questioned by rangers and by visitors. And, we have to give them, it sucks that we have to give them a history lesson of this place and how this is our right to be able to do that. But we are always continuous teachers. And so that, and then we also do a traditional diet study where we're working with participants, getting them on traditional foods and analyzing them for over 3 months, and really looking at their biomarkers and looking at how is this food changing their stuff that's going on in their body, and how is it helping them with their illnesses or mental health or things like that. But the largest part of it is, how do we get people connected again? How do we get people to get that connection and that relationship with their identity, with the land, with the food themselves, because you can't take a person in survival mode and expect them to know what's going on the land. You can't expect them to know that there's climate crisis going on, that there's the policies and things that are going on behind them, because they're stuck in the survival mode. So getting them out of that. The other part is the Backpackers Ferry. We get world travelers from all over the place, backcountry hikers, all of these people come in, and the knowledge that they have on not only Indigenous people, but the people that are here within this park. They often, they ask about the Indians and where are they? They kind of expect us to be living as we were before the park completely demolished our relationship that we had with it. And so a lot of it is education. And so we drive them to different trailheads, or we don't do so much hiking. We do a lot of it is in the shuttling, but that could be anywhere from half an hour to hours being in the car. And so while I got you locked in there with me, I'm going to teach you something. So really helping them open their perspective of not only the history of this land, the people of this land, the things that the people are still doing today to steward this land. I always, people think it's so crazy that when I tell them that Blackfeet people, we've been on this land for thousands and thousands of years, since time immemorial, and to them that concept just doesn't coexist with them. And so getting people just to understand what is going on here, how times have changed, what we have had to go through and what we continue to go through with the park, and with these different public lands, and what kind of happens to us in our healing and our sciences and everything that kind of comes in between. So that's myself, and thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. That was great. So one of the things I wanted to sort of relook at, and Heather had mentioned this earlier, I think, was kind of that idea that the Wilderness Act is one of those pieces of federal legislation that really, and I believe the word that you used, Heather, was sacrosanct, right? It's kind of like, it's like sacred text to certain people, and even kind of the thinking about changing it or modifying it, people really get upset about that. And even having these kinds of conversations. In fact, a few years ago, I wrote this very short piece that was in the local newspaper here in Montana. And the title of it was "Say Goodbye to the Words Wild and Wilderness." And I really thought like no one was going to read this, or just, a couple of my grad students. I got a lot of pushback from just that article, saying that we really need to rethink these words and this idea that is very much part of this false narrative that we have as part of the United States. And in fact, I have said in more than one place, it's like taking something that is a lie and turning it into federal law. And so one of the things I wanted folks to think about or address is, what would it mean today to rewrite the Wilderness Act? What would it mean to revise it so that it can perhaps serve the land back movement, right? What would it mean to try to incorporate Indigenous people and Indigenous people's land practices back into that public policy? So I'm just going to throw that out there, but I might ask Heather to address first, and then maybe Carl and Kristen.
Sure. Thanks, Ross. I'll take a stab at that. I'm sure others will have a lot to add, but thinking about the ways in which the Wilderness Act could be improved, I think that there's a lot of room for improvement, of course, and we're seeing sort of the beginnings of attempts to more appropriately relate with Native peoples, with tribal nations in the modern era when it comes to land management practices in the federal lands, wilderness and otherwise, but we have this movement towards things like co-management, right, or co-stewardship of federal lands between the federal government and tribal nations. And those are existing tools in the policy toolbook that I think are useful and maybe could be codified and expanded on in a rewriting or a restructuring of the Wilderness Act and the ways in which these lands are managed and the ways in which we perceive their value to everyone in American society, not just to wealthy non-native people who want to come and be tourists and pretend that they haven't had a huge impact on our natural world for brief periods of time, right? As an escape from the modern world. They're not an escape from the modern world. They're part of the modern world. And so are Indigenous peoples, and our lifeways and our values deserve to survive through the modern world as well. And our relationships with these landscapes need to survive. And if they haven't been active, they need to be re-perpetuated. Indigenous peoples need to be rematriated to these lands. Our practices, our beliefs need to be restored with relationship to these landscapes. And I look to places like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for guidance on the ways in which that should happen, and for like really great pronouncements of the values and concepts that really need to guide that type of reform. We talk a lot in the federal Indian law world about consultation, right? The trust relationship between the United States and tribal nations. And consultation, as admitted by the United States itself when the UN Declaration was finally given support by the United States in 2010, consultation is not consistent with the Declaration's articles, right? Consultation falls short of the standards that international law has come to recognize as sort of the ways in which states and Indigenous peoples should relate and work with each other. There's a different concept called free, prior, and informed consent that I think really needs to guide all of these ideas, all of these reform efforts. Free, prior, and informed consent is a much higher standard than consultation. It's not just, we're going to talk to you about what we want to do, and then we're going to say we've talked to you and go ahead and do what we were going to do anyway. Free, prior, and informed consent provides the means for a process through which goals, ideals, critical information, and expected impacts and results can be shared in order to come to a place where informed decisions can be made. At the end of a process involving FPIC, and I think FPIC is a process rather than a standard. A lot of people talk about it as a rule or a standard, but I think it's more of a process in application. If we went through the process of FPIC, when we looked at ways in which wilderness areas are managed, involving Indigenous peoples at every stage in which they believe they should be involved, giving Indigenous peoples the choice on when and where they're engaged, then I think we'd have a much different picture of how these things work. And we'd go beyond co-management to, real and true relationships and cooperative practices that engage and restore Indigenous relationships to lands. How can that be part of a rewritten Wilderness Act? Why not, right? Why not legislate FPIC? Why not put FPIC into a federal statute? I think that would be fantastic. We're moving in that direction. Hopefully we continue, and the momentum continues to build as we see these efforts being providing successful results that people agree are positive and a step in the right direction.
I wanted to start by saying I think it's really appropriate that both Heather and Kristen are part of this conversation, because if you know the history, Yellowstone National Park, it's surprising that Heather said, I mean, it's not surprising, but Heather said the crows were presented as having no relationship to that landscape. In fact, when Yellowstone was created, it actually overlapped. The Congress didn't really know the mapping well, and they created an overlap where it overlapped Yellowstone with the Crow Reservation, the initial Crow Reservation. And of course, you might imagine what happened in that instance. Well, the Crows had to give up some of their land to make Yellowstone National Park. Of course, they'd already given up others for that land as well, along with other people, Shoshonean people and others. And then, of course, in Kristen's case, again, a large chunk of their reservation was taken for glacier. And so these are peoples with direct experience of this removal of land for conservationist, preservationist purposes. And one thing I've noticed as I've talked about this history is it can make, and Rosalyn already alluded to this, it can make people very angry. And it's interesting me to sit and think about why people get so angry when you reveal this history. I remember getting a lot of angry reviews when my first book came out, and no one said the history was that I got the history wrong in the sense there were errors in the book. It's just they didn't like the implications of it, because if you're saying parks are built on indigenous removal, then the implication seems to be, which isn't what I said in my book, but they seem to be saying, well, you should just get rid of national parks and do whatever you want with the landscape. But I would say, and here I'm just building on what Heather said, is that our first step is having an accurate and true history, right? We need to start from that point of truth, and we can't, I think, have a truly sustainable relationship to the environment unless we're being honest with ourselves and honest with others. So that's really the starting point. The second thing I wanted to say is that, you know, it's good to have large areas that are protected as much as possible from capitalist intrusion. So I am not necessarily opposed to doing that, even though I have my critiques of the Wilderness Act as currently written. I would say, though, that one of the ironies that we need to think about, and this has to do a lot with the kind of dualistic thinking that prevails in a lot of Western, in the Western mind, is that the challenge we have is that by creating wilderness areas, we've also sort of created non-wilderness areas, which are really sacrifice zones. So what we're saying is, okay, we can't touch this space, but we're sort of letting people do whatever they want in these other places and really just as much capitalist development as possible. And so I think that's ultimately not getting us where we need to be if we're saying, well, there's this very small 4.5% of the United States that we'll try to leave as untouched as possible. But the other, I'm bad at math, 95.5%, we can kind of more or less do whatever we want with. So I think that's one challenge, like large meta challenge of the Wilderness Act, is actually thinking about the vast majority of the landscape that isn't included within the wilderness areas. And then my last thought about this in terms of rewriting the Wilderness Act, I mean, Heather suggested some very good specific sort of measures. I would say I would retain the idea of trying to have spaces that are as protected as possible, although we need to think about, whenever you say protected, you need to think protected from whom and protected for whom, right? We need to ask those questions. But the other thing I would say is I would really love to get rid of the term wilderness. I know I'm going to be a little controversial here. I guess I'm with you, Rosalyn, on this. I just think the word wilderness is so freighted with so much cultural baggage that misleads us about our history that I think we would need to come up with a different term. So about a year or so ago, Phil Delory and I did a presentation to the Wilderness Society about the indigenous relationship to conservation. And I went out and I think I agree with a lot of what the Wilderness Society is doing, but I said, I don't think your name is actually helping you anymore. I think that you should maybe think about rechanging the name or changing the name. And I think in the same way, if we want to think about rewriting the Wilderness Act, I would give it some other name. And I would like to have something that would signal the importance of indigenous people to this, because those landscapes were not, and we can unpack this word more, not untouched or untrammeled. As my understanding of untrammeled is, untouched, undamaged. They were actually being managed by indigenous people, and it's very misleading. The term wilderness kind of occludes all of that and doesn't lead us, again, to very helpful ways of relating to the landscape.
Thank you. Kristen, you got anything to add?
Sure. I mean, I would also suggest the rewording of wilderness as well, too. A lot of times when we run into different folks that are getting in our cars and trying to understand this area, so we operate around a lot too, they're called CDT hikers, Continental Divide hikers. And so they're really crazy, and they walk all the way from Mexico, all the way to the Canadian border. And they usually end their journey, our most sacred mountain, Chief Mountain, Nanastaku. So they either start their journey or they end their journey in this area. Now, that whole time they're coming through this area, they're we're trying to teach them about, the utilization of what we did throughout the mountains, because they often think that, oh, we don't see them now, so they obviously weren't there in the previous time either. So thinking that the whole place is, they kind of develop this concept of entitlement of, this, I don't know, we'll go somewhere else with that. But the fact of the matter is that our people were using that same exact route that they are walking on, and they're, hyping up on YouTube and social media and Instagram and things, but we have been using those routes for thousands and thousands of years, whether that's trading, whether that's connection or relationship with other tribal nations. Now, today, one of the things that I would strongly suggest is building those relationships. I often find myself at these different workshops or conferences or things with different folks from conservation agencies all over the place, and they always ask the one question of, how do I make a connection with Indigenous people so I can learn more, so that we can, build these practices in our policies and our own tools and stuff. And it's as simple as coming down to creating that relationship. And honestly, those that are working in these agencies too, is holding those folks into accountability of making sure that those relationships are created and sustained. I really appreciate our superintendent that we have, our new superintendent that we have of Glacier Park, Dave Romer, and that his active ability to be able to come and make a relationship with us folks. He's always at different conferences, different meetings, talks. He's even to the point where he is invited to our ceremonies. And I got to watch 2 weeks ago, some of our people were able to do our first ceremony, a beaver ceremony. The beaver ceremony to us is a very, very a loving, very prominent thing in our culture, a society in our culture, and we hold very dear to it. Now, we haven't been able to practice ceremony in these mountains for over 100 years or so, and this 2 weeks ago was the first time we were able to hold a beaver sweat, to be able to put up a beaver lodge and do the beaver bundle opening. Now, Dave Romer came to this. He invited his staff to go to this. They got to take the day off. They sat in lodge with us. They made relationships with us. They ate with us. They learned practices with us. And we also got to watch Dave receive his Blackfeet name. And it shows his commitment that he has to making that relationship. So really, what I try to strive on is a relationship all the way.
So what do people think then about if there is an effort to change and rewrite the Wilderness Act now that it's 60 years, now that we're celebrating its 60th anniversary, what kinds of threats do you think might exist if it is revised, if it is rewritten? Is this one of those things where one of the critiques I've heard when I've said, hey, we need to change this, people say, oh my gosh, Roz, the minute we start changing things, that's the slippery slope. That's, you're opening the door, and now we're gonna, there's going to be capitalism and consumerism, and all of this stuff is going to happen because we're changing the definition, we're changing, the legislation. But do you think that there are any real threats out there if we are thinking about how to revise this and how to tell a truer story, one of the United States, but also how to incorporate again Indigenous peoples back, not only onto the land, but Indigenous peoples back into our public policy? I think I'll ask Heather again first.
Okay, let me try. I should close the chat too, so that I don't watch it while I'm trying to talk. I think that there's certainly, from a pragmatic perspective, there are very real dangers if we talk about immediate efforts to reform legislation in the current political environment. We might get things that we absolutely wouldn't want in the current Congress and in the way that it's comprised. So yeah, those are great points, and they're very true. if we were thinking and brainstorming and dreaming of a way in which we can improve something that will at some point probably be revisited, and are we going to be ready to come in with every well thought out, well structured proposal, then I think that's the conversation we're having. If we have the opportunity, what will we do with it? And I think that they're like, again, like I said, I think we can look to some international law documents that set out some great structures, great standards, number of studies that have sort of developed the concepts in the UN Declaration and applied them. We have examples from other places where these things have sort of started to take root. There's an ongoing inquiry internationally right now about the ways in which the conservation movement globally has displaced Indigenous peoples and is sort of the source for very grave human rights violations in a number of places where ecological tourism is the bread and butter of local economies and national economies. So these aren't isolated conversations we're having. They're not unrealistic. They're not untimely. I think that it's an important talk that we should be having here and now. Another thing I wanted to add to follow up on some of what I was saying in the previous question was that treaty rights continue to be viable and real and tangible and important to Indigenous peoples today. Carl mentioned our relationships to Yellowstone Park. We have treaty rights in the park. They have not been abrogated. As a matter of fact, in 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld my tribe's treaty rights in the Bighorn National Forest in Wyoming. Under that rationale, we also have existing treaty rights in Yellowstone Park. The park's establishment did not abrogate our treaty rights. The ways in which we decide to respect and work with the existing authorities in regulating activity by our tribal members in parks and national forests is something that we as a sovereign will continue to do and to update the ways in which we see the appropriate role of our people in these landscapes where we have existing, viable, legally upheld rights.
So my cop-out answer would be that as a historian, it's a lot easier for me to tell the past and sort of imagine what we should be doing in the future. I do recognize it's interesting to think that when the Wilderness Act passed, it passed with such resounding bipartisan support. And I actually don't think that there would be the same, I could be wrong, but I don't think there'd be the same kind of support for some kind of alteration, which is, I think, just revealing of how our society has shifted since 1964. In the same ways, I don't think we could pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 today either. And in fact, there's been a kind of chipping away at a lot of the Civil Rights Act through the Supreme Court rulings and everything else. So the one argument would be, well, we should cling to this is the best we have and we should just cling to it. But I do think, sort of echoing what Heather said, there is something to be said for just trying to think about what our ideals would be and what kind of society we want to be. And I would just come back to the point that I feel strongly as a historian, that the Wilderness Act really does erase a lot of history, particularly Indigenous history. And that I don't think that that's ultimately, if we think about sustainability, I don't ultimately think that it's sustainable to have that kind of arrangement. And so I think we really do need to be prepared if we want to be a healthy society and have a healthy environment, that we need to think about something that would be a more inclusive and a different kind of definition of wilderness, as difficult as, which is why these conversations are important, as difficult as it is to imagine what exactly would be the legislation and how would we get it through, Congress and whatnot.
And I just kind of have a short answer, honestly, but I guess I would say that as kind of going down through the bottom and really just saying that maybe it'd be the best for, the act itself is very much, of course, erasing us as a people and our voices And as much voices that we can get in there will start to change things. The more people that we get in there will start to change the different ideas and perspectives. But what I would like to see, though, for myself is seeing a lot more Indigenous folks in these positions, in these agencies, to be able to hold these guys accountable, or to also, I mean, it sucks that, like I said, it sucks having to always teach, but that is something that we have to do until we get to something that we need, or to an end goal. So having folks in there and holding folks accountability.
No, thanks, Kristen. That's a great point. At the end, you know, it does feel like sometimes Indigenous people and Carl historians are always, it feels like we're teaching and reteaching and kind of just that constant reminder of like, you know, hey, Indigenous people are here, we're still here, we're still here, we're still here. That still, even though we can say it numerous times, it doesn't sometimes feel like it gets heard, because we are still being having to be the ones who continually advocate and be at the forefront. But I totally agree. We need more Indigenous folks across the board in agencies and NGOs working for the federal government, and we're there. We are there. Those of us who work in, you know, higher ed, we see Native people graduate every single year, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, PhDs. We are out there, we're educated, you know, people are ready to take these positions. It's just, we need to get more folks in there. And the NGOs, especially, and agencies need to stop saying no one's out there for us to utilize in these positions. So I'm gonna get off my soapbox there. And I think we're moving over to Steve, who is going to help share some of the Q&A that has been occurring while we have been visiting.
Yeah, thank you all for this wonderful panel. And we have, I think, 22 questions from the audience, and we're going to answer all of them in the next 10 minutes. I'm kidding. A lot of the broad questions that you are answering already are kind of, people are looking for more details. People are asking you to, you know, directly, you know, what would replace the term wilderness, these sorts of things. But I think there are two questions that you've touched on that I think we could flesh out or rephrase slightly. Okay. So, and I'll ask them in the order from one that's more defensive to one that's more positive. So, Mark asks early on, actually, in the session, and this really relates to the last question you asked, Roz. To me, the practical question is how we can correct the Wilderness Act without opening the door to either anti-earth interests, gutting any protections these designations might afford, or a white land rush to exploit what has been designated as a wilderness under the banner of fairness. So, of course, the Wilderness Act was established, like the national parks, to kind of balance out extractive interests. And there's a grand tradition of mining operations and so on creeping onto the boundaries of these wilderness zones, you know, as far as they could possibly go. And Carl's touched on this as well, in terms of the history of these wilderness protections and so on, and what they've been for, right? I think there's something like 40 active bills to alter the Wilderness Act or the boundaries or rules related to specific areas protected by the Wilderness Act. So, and those are coming mostly from mining, military, and recreation, right? Should Indigenous nations be a big player in that, right? Should that be a fourth player, right? And if we want to think of this question a little bit differently than you phrased it, Roz, I think we might ask, if the question isn't should we or should we not, how do we organize and what do we need to do for our side to come out ahead in this legislative struggle? And so it's sort of like, how do we get to the place we need to be? And the second question that I think is going to open up a more positive vision for why we're even talking about this in the first place comes from Olivia. She asks, what would it mean to rematriate these lands, especially wilderness areas? So what I appreciate about that question is it's not asking you to define a policy on the spot, right? But actually, what difference would the rematriation of these kinds of lands make to the everyday lives, the traditional practices, the lifeways, the social economic futures of Indigenous nations whose ancestors lived on or subsisted on those lands? So perhaps we'll deal with the how do we get to where we need to go, and then when we get there, what will it enable?
Anyone who wants to jump in, go for it.
I think I'm gonna try to go in there what this might do if, you know, we have more of our voices inside of there. So last year we became the first, was it last year? I think I'm not thinking right now, I'm having a brain fart at the moment, but we are the first tribal nation to have free roaming buffalo within our parks and tribal lands. It's been a long battle to try to get the buffalo rematriated with the land, and what that would mean. For one, not only is it a keystone species, but it's a cultural keystone species for us. So losing the buffalo over these last 100 or so years, it did many damages, and we could see how bringing the buffalo back now has done so many wonderful things for the Blackfeet Nation and for other tribes itself. For one, our food, for one, our land, our economic values, things like that. So last year, having them released, and then the tribe also planning on releasing more, I believe what they want to look at too is not only what that means for our people, but what that means for the land. Without the buffalo being out on the land for the last 100 or so years, what that has changed in our grasses and our plants and our waterways. And now that them being back on the land, what that can mean for our climate and what that could bring back. Could it bring back species that have been gone away for some time? Could it clean up the waters? Could it implement more traditional plants to help soak up the carbon in the air, or help with the chronic wasting disease that is going on? So all of these different ways of how putting this keystone species back into its original place and what that can do. Now, what we see in loopholes inside the Wilderness Act is really odd to me, but a lot of machinery and things weren't allowed to be in wilderness areas or so. But why were cows able to be in the wilderness and to be able to I want to say ruin land, but they don't do the best to land. They don't work the best with land. And so what I would like to see, and maybe what this might enable into, is to see in our buffalo even more, or other tribal nations to be able to rematriate their buffalo onto their land, or even further.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit to that. I think that's a really great way to focus the conversation on, the example of buffalo, and as a cultural keystone species to so many of our peoples in our region, like what that has meant. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of real movement to have this visible re-establishment of a cultural presence and a cultural species on lands where it had been eliminated, right? In a way to try and bring Native peoples into a place where we couldn't exist without reliance on the federal government. But when the question, I think that I've seen a lot in the chat and the Q&A is like, well, what do you want, right? What would this look like? And there's no easy answer to that, and there's no easy way for the federal government to get there. If you know what one tribal nation wants, you know what one tribal nation wants, right? So doing this right will be time consuming, right? It'll take a lot of hours of people's time. It'll take a lot of time from tribal nations. If this is something we prioritize, we will engage and we'll do it, right? And the same needs to be true from the federal government as well, right? What a tribal presence, what rematriation looks like on an ancestral area might look really different between the Blackfeet and the Crow in a place like Yellowstone. It could look really different, you know, anywhere in the country when we have a lot of different peoples who had relationships with different landscapes and habitats. You know, we talk a lot about how we restore or how we elevate the rights of land bases, right? There's this rights of nature movement that people, that resonates a lot with people in our communities, I think. And when we think about what that means, you know, what we really need to do is restore relationships, right? On the terms that each of us feel are appropriate. And we all have different values. We all have different histories. We all have different visions for our futures. And I think that's really what people need to understand, is that there's no one size fits all definition. Terminology is always going to be something we're going to struggle with and we're going to have to work through. This is hard work, right? But we've been through a lot of hardships over the past 500 years. And that doesn't mean that we should throw up our hands and say this is too hard, because it shouldn't be.
Those were both great comments. I don't have a lot to add, but one thought I do have, which is basically just building on what Heather said and a little bit on what Kristen said, is that, you know, wilderness is the seduction of it in part is that it's a very simple idea. And the notion is you call something a wilderness, you keep people out and, you know, problem solve. And I think the reality is that it's much more complex than that. And so it is going to be much more complicated to think about what does it mean to not use the term wilderness, but think about this as a, you know, an indigenous homeland and really collection of homelands, because often, you know, there's multiple groups that have interactions with Yellowstone, with all of these landscapes. And so each of them might have different thoughts about how to interact with that. And so it's going to be a much more complicated situation. But the little bit that I've learned in working with some of these treaty rights cases, that it just gave me a different sense of time. I think that a lot of non-natives like myself are thinking of, well, let's do this in the next 4 years or whatever. Native people have been on this land for millennia, and they're often thinking in terms of very long time periods, like we may need to work on this for decades, lifetimes, centuries, whatever, but we want to do it right, and it may take that long. And so that's just a really different way of thinking about time, but it's also a different way of thinking about what the solutions are. And I really like Kristen's example of the rematriating the buffalo, and I wanted to just throw out some thought exercise that I've often grappled with myself, which is to say that in the late 1990s, the Park Service, you know, reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone National Park. And this had all sorts of, you know, good effects on the ecology there, another kind of keystone species, and really helping to restore the ecology in Yellowstone. And there was a sense we need to bring back the predators. But it's really striking to me that that's sort of where the conversation stopped. And there is one other being that was in Yellowstone that has not been recognized, which would be Indigenous peoples. And there's been no conversation really about how could we ever reintroduce, as it were, Indigenous people to Yellowstone in any sort of, I mean, that sounds a little, I don't want it to sound that way, but, you know, have that presence be there again. And, you know, the Park Service will do things like trying to do burning now, which tries to mimic the practices that Indigenous people had of burning. But there's no sense that, well, we would let Indigenous people direct this burning. We will just have the Park Service try to mimic the burning that Indigenous people did. And so I think that sort of conceptual roadblock that we're dealing with about how would we think about what does it mean to have Native people back at Yellowstone is part of this larger conceptual set of roadblocks, but at least that non-Native people have dealing with these sorts of issues, because most of us have grown up in this culture and been saturated with wilderness mythology, and it's very hard for us to get outside of that particular box.
So Steve, do we have time for another question? Or are we good to go at this point?
Unfortunately, we are out of time. So Roz, if you have any like final thoughts to wrap us up, and I think then you can shoot it to Becca for some closing words.
No, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for taking your time with us today. For the folks who participated in the audience, and there was a very vibrant conversation that was going on in the chat for folks who see this later. And thank you so much for our people who were part of the roundtable discussion today. We really appreciated your voice Really appreciated what you had to share with us, and this was a really great conversation. Thank you.
Rosalyn, thank you to you for your work in curating and moderating the event. And thank you, Heather, Kristen, and Carl for your time and your knowledge and your perspectives here. And to our audience, whether this event or discussion struck a chord or a nerve, we would love your feedback. You're going to see a poll pop up on the screen if you haven't already, and we'll email out a survey as well. You can do one or the other. And just to reinforce, yes, we will be sharing out the recording as well as the chat transcript. We'll be posting it online and we'll email it out to everyone who registered. So much appreciation to our sponsors, Luce Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, and For Culture, to our event team at the Natural History Museum, and our tech maestro at Alluvium Gatherings, Cal Moody. And if you enjoyed this event, I invite you to please check out our website at thenaturalhistorymuseum.org, where you can learn more about our work. You can sign up for our email list to hear about the next event in the series. And also on this 10-year anniversary of the Natural History Museum, you could make a donation to support the next 10 years as an independent museum for the movement. We take no money from corporate polluters or climate deniers. We rely on individuals like you. So thank you again, everyone. Now we're going to close you out with a song, Son of the Sun, by Micmac songwriter and activist Willie Dunn. Take care and see you at the next one.
Son of the sun, son of the earth, the soul of light, children of the world, daughters of starlight, daughters of mirth, sisters of sunlight.